Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with this old hymn. If y'all would like to stand. All right. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. God answers prayer. God answers prayers. God answers prayers. He's so good to me. I love him so. I love him so. I love him so. He's so good to me. Good morning. This morning I have the pleasure and honor to introduce one of my closest friends, a mentor. He's a minister at St. Mark Presbyterian, and he has his doctorate in theology. He's kind of a smart guy. Anyway, Craig Meyer.
Susan told a half-truth. She's a good friend. When she told me that you were looking at the letters of Peter, I thought, in a very short time, there might be just a couple of things I could say that would set a context as you go through and read it in parts. And two things. One is about the early church that Peter served as he moved among its various congregations. And the other is about Peter himself, about the early church. It was a church that was not perfect. Things are written to it and about it are not things we automatically believe. It was very, very convinced in almost all of its components, finding the letters of Paul and Peter and John, that the second coming was imminent, that Jesus was coming back, and that the needs of the congregation were to be so tightly knit in the face of persecution that they could remain pure, and there was not so much of the gospel, and none of the churches had the gospels by the time that these letters were written. It was almost 100 years later that any churches had all four of them. And so the understanding of Jesus reaching out to all people was the commandment, but the practice was people sort of living under the cover of darkness because it was illegal in many places for them to be Christians. And so some of the things that he wrote in these letters are really not consistent with some of the things that Jesus said about his welcoming of all people, that we don't judge one another. And there's a lot of things that tells people what's going to happen to those bad people who misbehave. And I think that reading the gospel of Jesus, when he talks about sin and two great commandments and all the law and the prophet are tied in with those two commandments, the last judgment. It's not, all the social behaviors that people see as sin so very often, but how you treat your neighbor, particularly those that you don't think are your neighbors because they don't behave like you do. So Peter was writing to churches that were living this way. The second thing is Peter was Peter, and we know about him from the gospel. And he was not a superhero, and he wasn't a pious kind of person. He was one that Jesus, as soon as Peter announced that Jesus was the Son of God, and Jesus said, that confession is the rock on which the church will be built. Your name now is Peter. A few verses later, he says, when Jesus tells him what's going to happen, you can't do that, Jesus. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Then we come to Holy Week, and Peter says, I don't care what everybody else does. I'm the number one disciple. And if they all betray you and abandon you, I won't. I'll be there. And Jesus said, no, you won't. He said, before the cock crows and dawn comes, you'll deny me 3 times. And he did. Interesting thing about Jesus in relationship to Peter and all of us is after the resurrection, not once did he ever bring it up. Hey, Peter, where were you when I needed you? He never once criticized him. He never called him to account. He just assumed that he'd take the next step and become the disciple he needed to be. And then Paul had his run-in with Peter, and he says, I challenged Peter because he sort of caved into the Jewish church in Jerusalem, those leaders, and was trying to say that the Gentiles had to become Jews before they become Christian. And I challenged him on it. So Peter was a person whose intellect and whose commitment is tied to the fact that he had one focus: the gospel of Jesus Christ as Lord that God sent for the salvation of humankind, and that was to be first and foremost. And how the church organized itself and behaved itself and related to one another and the society around them was one thing. But he kept always before them the fact that his whole ministry, his whole reason for existence, that he would give up in sacrifice for his faith, that whole thing was the love of God and Jesus Christ. And so I think one of the things, Presbyterians are a peculiar lot, or they wouldn't allow me in. But the fact of the matter is, we have a book of confessions where we have documents from each of the different ages of the church that we use as instruction. And in one of the more recent ones, it talks about the last judgment, the last times that these people were expecting. But in it, it says, we do not fear the judgment because the judge is our Redeemer. And that is what gave Peter the confidence to be who he was, say what he was, and help guide a church into the kinds of community where everybody had one another's back, where people behaved the way they were supposed to behave because they couldn't afford to be divisive in a world that hated them. And he led them and he showed them by his life and by his death what was expected of a Christian. And I think the very fact that he wasn't perfect is kind of a guide to us, because we don't have to expect to be perfect. We try our best to be as good as we can be. But at the end of the day, when we look back on what we did in the day and what we didn't do in the day, we know that the grace of God is the only reason we can sleep easy. And I think knowing that Peter and where he came from gives an extra kind of dynamic to what you guys are going to study in that. And I hope you find the guidance you need to help you lead the lives you want to lead in service to Christ. Okay? Oh, hey. She said, I tried to get you to say a prayer. Let's do. Gracious God, we live in a time where more than many times we face anxieties and disruptions and fear, and we're not real certain about the future. But remind us that this is the day you've given us, and in it you have provided for us all we need to live lives that are full of joy, because we know your grace follows us wherever we go, and to know that we have a purpose and a meaning and have the dignity and have the self-confidence to be people who make a change in the world around us. Guide us, lead us. Thank you. Amen.